in order to distract the community from noticing just how poorly Doom the Dark Ages has been received, the community has gone to one of their age-old just responses like, oh, if you don't like the game, if you're not happy with the game, if you're not playing the game, you're just not very good. And immediately they go to the absolute most bottom of the barrel, most pathetic, like reprehensible human beings on the platform, DarkSydePhil. You know, they immediately like clip something him of him streaming the game and saying that like, oh, this is the kind of person who is hating on Doom the Dark Ages. You know, someone who doesn't like video games, who would rather be uh, pulling Hulk Hogan's, right? You know, DarkSydePhil is just has been for a long time is seen as like everything wrong with the gaming community. And of course Phil didn't like that. You know, he came out, he started spurging out, you know, saying that people took what he did out of context, that he likes the game and all that, but like, you know, what interests me about this isn't that like, you know, Phil versus like the Doom community, right? Because I think both sides are just completely reprehensible. But like what to me, what I find interesting is just the attempts at trying to like distract people from the very real fact that like Doom the Dark Ages has not been as well received as Doom Eternal. Right. That this was evident like upon release that this game wasn't as played, that people weren't talking about it, that it didn't sell as well. And there were a lot of copes, you know, going around like as to why, you know, people spurged out about like Xbox Game Pass and, you know, people were blaming game journals, you know, but like what it really comes down to really is that Doom is a declining franchise. Nobody cares about it. It's generic, it's uninspired, it's boring. Um, and there is fundamentally no real room for innovation. You know, like the Dark Ages' great claim to fame is that ooh, it's a prequel this time. You're going into castles and stuff like that. It's like okay, but that's not Doom. You know, like again, this is the problem Doom has is that like at its core, it's a very generic shooter game where you just run around and just like press the shoot button over and over again. You know, there is though like it doesn't really have any iconic, you know, iconography, right? It's not like a brand the way that like Super Mario Bros. Is, where they can like, you know, take all these deviations and like put the characters in any kind of situations and any kind of genre and it just kind of works. Like if you take Doom off of Mars, like you just have a generic action game where you're fighting demons, you know. That's all this is. Like this is no different than like any other action game put out in the past several years. Is that Doom is just an unbearably generic action game. You know, one that really shouldn't be propped up the way it is. You know, so many people like come out and try and tell you that like Doom is this highly influential IP, that it's this huge deal, that it's this cultural phenomenon, and yet it just isn't. You know, like a lot of people were really surprised when Animal Crossing: New Horizons outperformed Doom Eternal. You know, it sold like what, like 10 times more than it at least. You know, without discount, like severely discounting it. Doom is just like one of those really forced, like westernized, like IPs that are just shoved down people's throats. You know, kind of like Ultima, or kind of like you know, any of those old like PC games like Myst or whatever that nobody actually plays. Like Doom is supposed to be like the benchmark, like hallmark, like example of like, you know, the defining Western video game. But like the reality is, and this is something the West really needs to acknowledge, is that the West is not and never has been a powerhouse when it comes to video games. You know, all of the real culturally significant video games that actually are influential and actually are actually popular and actually maintain their relevance like decades after the fact, they are all exclusively Japanese. People still play Pac-Man, people still play the original Super Mario Bros, people still play the original Legend of Zelda, they still play like Metroid and Pokemon and the original Pikmin, like the list goes on and on and on. There are dozens and dozens of examples of Japanese games that are way more culturally relevant than Doom, but simply don't have the same kind of hype around them because they aren't Western franchises. The Western gaming sphere has this very ignorant, self centered, like genuine belief that what they put out is bigger and better and more popular than what the Japanese do, when in reality, that is not and never has been true and at any point in its history. So, with that being said about like Doom the Dark Ages, this is like the typical AAA trilogy cycle. I used to call this the PlayStation cycle, but I think these days this kind of like correlates with like all major AAA games. This idea that like a game comes out and it's seen as like this huge influential thing. It's this cultural milestone. It's this huge deal, right? And then like the sequel is hyped up as being a better, like it's just the same thing but better, and then like you have the third game where like nobody actually played the first two and it just kind of falls off. That's basically what happened with the Doom Eternal games. That's what happened with the Doom reboot trilogy. Is that like people got bored of running around open arenas like mashing ZT to like just like, I'm sorry, the right trigger. What do you call it on the Xbox controller? Well, anyway, like the right trigger, mashing the right trigger button to like just slaughter demons over and over and over again, like the same repetitive enemies over and over and over again. Of course, people are gonna get bored of that. Like a change of like aesthetic and like environment isn't going to change the fact that like Doom the Dark Ages is just a slower, more boring, like rehashed version of like older Doom games. Like if you're interested in Doom, you may as well play the older games. But like there are better games than Doom out there. And that is like the grim reality that like Doom fanboys have to account for, is that like people don't want to spend their time just killing the same demons over and over and over again in different environments. Like Doom has to do a whole lot more to innovate if it wants to stay relevant. And in spite of its best attempts at doing that, incorporating like platforming elements into Doom Eternal and the dashing and stuff like that, in spite of like its best efforts, it has not really truly been successful at doing that. Doom the Dark Ages seems like one of the big underwhelming titles of the year, and we are still in this period where the community doesn't want to acknowledge it.